All right, good morning, everyone. Those of you who were here on Tuesday, and that's most of you, I think, know that that sounds means two things. The second is pursuant to the first. The first thing that it means, of course, is that's the sound that indicates that class has officially started. And the second thing, by inference, is that it's an indication to you that you should power down your cell phone if you haven't already done that. Okay? So, let's get up and running. I want to say just quickly a word to the people who are logged in to the live session, the online people. If you'll raise your hands for me real quickly so that I'll know that you can hear me. Okay, very good. I think we have 4 people in that live session. Even though this class is really for the people here who are here on campus, I'm letting you all do live sessions in the online classes as well, because some of you prefer that. At any rate, what I wanted to say was that there is a class session, another class that holds a session in the class meeting. This is a 10:50 class, so that I guess is a 9. No way, it would be a. What time does the second class start? 9:25. That would be a 9:25 class. Anyway, it ran a little bit long today, and it was difficult for me. I scrambled a little bit to try to get everything set up by the time the start of this class began. I just wanted to say to you all in the future, if you log in and it gets to be 10:50 and the live feed is not set up yet, don't panic. It probably just means that got a little bit of a late start setting everything up. Okay. All right. So let's jump to first order of business, which is to call the names on the class roster here for the people in the face-to-face class, and we may have 1 or 2 people who are here today that were not here on Tuesday. By the way, I realized something after classes were over on Tuesday. I have this class that runs from 10:50 to 12:05, and immediately following that in this classroom, I have one that runs from 12:15 to 1:30. And I noticed from time to time over that 3-hour period that I was feeling a little, lightheaded. I guess that's the most accurate way to say it. And I kind of concluded that that was because talking for 3 hours with a mask on means that I'm probably taking in a lot of my own carbon dioxide. And that makes a person certainly made me a little bit lightheaded. I don't think it'll be a problem, but if I am feeling that way, I'll probably just step out in the hallway, take my mask off for a second, take in some good oxygen, and then come back in. It won't be an issue. Okay? All right. Let's run through the names on the roster real quick. Natalie Arana. Okay, thank you. Victoria Chatham. Or Chapman, I'm sorry. Where? Okay. Jacob Escobedo. Johan Fitch. Angie Garcia. Okay. Maria Garcia. Adam Garia. Everett Hutchins. Okay. Hisham Khan. Okay. Amara Marumer. Okay. Alex Scobie. Okay. Christian Shaw. And Corey Spencer. Okay. And Joanna Vinicutter. Okay, did I miss anyone? Okay, good. Almost got 100% today. All right, so with that bit of business done, I want to, before we jump into a discussion of material, I want to open the floor to any questions that you may have. I hope you took my advice and read through the documents on the course syllabus, particularly, or excuse me, on the course website, particularly the course syllabus. Should read that from top to bottom. Any questions? I said we could take a couple of minutes at the top of today's class meeting to field questions. Yes, ma'am.
So where's the additional reading to the textbook? I couldn't find it on that one.
Oh, you know what? I realized this morning that I have not linked that to you guys, and I will do that just as soon as I can after my second class session is over today. I will link that up for you. Okay? Yes. I apologize for that. I think it's linked up in all the other classes except for this one. Okay. What else? Yes.
Can we use the textbook, like the online version, or does it have to be the hard copy?
The digital copy of We the People is exactly the same as the hard back copy, the paper, the physical copy. The cautionary note that I want to issue to you is you've got to make sure that you get the full edition.
It's around 751 pages.
Probably.
I want to make sure I'm getting the right.
Yeah, just don't get the Essentials edition. If you get the Essentials edition, you're going to be probably challenged on the reading quizzes to, do well. There's just too much that doesn't match up, or like I said last time, I think the chapters don't even match up, at least all the way through the two versions of the book. But inside each chapter, in each individual chapter, the information is not as complete in the Essentials version. So I've looked at the digital version of the textbook, and as far as I can tell, it's identical. Okay? So that's perfectly fine if you prefer to do that. Okay? Yes, sir.
All right, so my sister, she had the 11th edition. I know there's much of a difference between the 12th and the 11th. Maybe like by a couple of pages. Would you really suggest I get the 12th edition?
Well, the problem that you run into there, and if I didn't mention this point to you on Tuesday, I had intended to mention it to you. The devil is in the details, as they say. Have you heard that expression?
No,
Okay. Well, you can do whatever you want, whatever you have to make. I might have mentioned to you all on Tuesday that I have a background in economics. And like most economists, I believe that human beings are rational creatures. That is to say, among other things, what that means is that we make cost-benefit calculus when we have decisions. We have some perception of what the costs and the benefits are with each alternative, and when we make that decision, ultimately what we're doing is we say, well, we think we're going to get more benefit out of doing this than doing that, right? So if in your judgment, everything taken into consideration, you're better off with the 11th edition than the edition we're using, that's your decision to make. However, to be a really good rational actor, you need as much information as you can possibly have when you make decisions. And so all I really want to say to you is the devil is in the details. And what I mean by that is that there is going to be some detailed information in the textbook to which is subject to quizzing on the weekly reading quizzes that you could trip you up. I'll give you an example, okay? In the chapter on elections, that 11th edition is not going to have the most up-to-date, well, even the 12th edition doesn't have the most up-to-date because it's now it's like the most recent election results they're going to have is from 2018, not from 2020, right? But that 11th edition is only going to have election results from 2016. You see what I'm saying? So you could get questions on a reading quiz that are really based on specific information that's in the current edition that we're using that's not in that 11th edition. Okay? But the broad approach of the textbook is the same. The general themes are similar. It's in the details. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
What was she talking about, the reading stuff on Blackboard?
Part of your reading assignment for, let me do this real quick so that the people online have the benefit of the best information too. Okay, so if you go to the course syllabus, the very end of the document is where The calendar of due dates and all that kind of stuff is listed, the topics that we cover. Notice that in addition, for the reading assignment for this week, in addition to chapter 1 in the textbook, We the People means the textbook, there is a web document that I've created for you called a Public Policy Primer Part 1. That's something that I wrote. It's a PDF file format. And I just forgot to link it up for you guys. And I apologize for that, but I will correct that as soon as I possibly can this afternoon. Okay? It's about, I don't know, about 5-6 pages or something like that. I honestly don't remember how long it is, but it's not as long as a chapter in a textbook. that way, I think I'm confident in saying that. Okay? All right. Anything else? Yes.
I had a read over the core competency assessment document that you put out. Just a couple of questions. Like, how long does the essay need to be? So I can see.
She's talking about the instructions document for core competency number 1, and I'm going to get core competency 2 out there pretty quickly as well, because I want you to have those as early in the semester as possible. You're talking about this document right here, right? This became active yesterday afternoon, okay? And you're right, there is no guidance provided to you about length. I just don't do that. I don't tell students that it needs to be a certain number of pages or a certain number of words. And there's 2 main reasons, my motivation, there's 2 main things there. Number one, if I have discovered over many years of experience teaching college level courses that if I give students a page length requirement or a word count requirement, that becomes the number one objective, right? And everything seems to, in terms of the product that they turn in, seems to be revolving around that objective, okay? Number 2, people have different writing styles. Your writing style is not the same as, her writing style. And what you may be able to say in X number of pages may take her X plus 2 number of pages, right? So those are the 2 main reasons I don't give that. All I really say to students is do a complete job, but be thorough, but be concise. So one of the things that means is it's incumbent upon you, once you've written a draft of your paper, not to submit it immediately, right? Now, if you're working up to the last minute, that may happen. You write your draft of the paper and say, I only got 2 minutes left to turn it in. I don't have time to do what? You know what I'm getting at, right? Proofread it, right? And one of the things that you want to do during your proofreading is take out superfluous language, right? That's one way to get it concise, right? To take out anything that doesn't really contribute to the arguments that you're making in your essay, okay?
The other question I had around that was normally when I've written essays before, I've already just sort of concentrated on one argument as the title, whereas on here it sort of mentions looking at different areas. In terms of how we structure that, are we looking at more than one argument?
You can take a broad approach and kind of give, for those of you who haven't read the instructions document yet, it may not be clear to why I say it this way. You can give your reader sort of a broad understanding of the Constitution, okay, and its principles, or you can focus on one specific principle of the Constitution. If you do that latter approach, you also want to find a way to give some indication that you have some understanding of how this specific principle that you're talking about fits into the broader principles of the Constitution. Is this like a one-off principle of the Constitution that doesn't make any sense or doesn't seem to have any connection to the rest of the Constitution, or does it seem to fit in nicely with the broader principles of the Constitution? Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Anything else you want to ask about before we jump in? Okay, what do you guys have on Tuesday coming up? Yeah, when you come in on Tuesday at 10:50, probably right out of the gate, that's what I'm planning on right now. It might change, but I reserve the right to do it at any point during the Tuesday class session. But right now, what I'm planning is just to get us going with that, kind of get that initial one underway. Is like right when we come in at 10:50 on Tuesday, we'll do that quiz. Yes.
Are those multiple choice?
Yeah, remember the lecture quizzes are multiple choice format, and I generally have 5 choices. It's usually A through E, okay? The reading quizzes are true, false.
And how many questions?
10, there'll be 10. And we're only gonna take 5 minutes to do it. And sometimes at the very beginning of the semester, I've been given reading quizzes now in this way in face-to-face classes for about, I do them in online classes too, but I've been doing it this way and limiting it to 5 minutes for about 3 or 4 years, probably 6 or 7 at least long semesters. I've been doing reading quizzes every week, and I've tested out that 5 minutes seems to be the optimal quiz period, okay? At the beginning of the semester, the first time you take one of these quizzes or the second time you take one of these quizzes, for some people, maybe even the third time they take one of these quizzes, they get a little frustrated. It's not because what I'm going to do is I'm not going to, again, because we don't want to pass out paper, okay? Even if that wasn't an issue, I would do it this way because that's the way I've been doing it previously. I don't pass out a piece of paper to you and you answer it. I put the questions up on the screen, and they're up there. If there's 10 questions, that means each one is up on the screen for 30 seconds. All right? So we all do it together that way. Okay? And as I said, I've tested that out over about 6 or 7 long semesters now, and 30 seconds per item on the quiz seems to be the optimal period, the optimal amount of time. Don't get frustrated, right? You'll get into the rhythm of that quizzing process early on. Remember, 4 of them are dropped anyway, okay? So, all right, good. What else? Everybody online still with me? Okay. So what I'm going to do is you're not going to see me now for a little while because I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to get started with some material. Actually, I think in this class we did a little bit of that on Tuesday, right? Didn't we start a little bit? We didn't get very far, if I remember correctly, but we at least started. Okay, one more time real quick. For those of you in the online class, if you'll raise your hand and tell me that if you see on the screen Introduction to Politics and Policy. For those of you here in the classroom, I hope you can indulge me in doing that. I just want to make sure that I'm not investing the time and energy to record this class or to send this feed to them and they're not seeing what I think they're seeing. Okay? All right, so let's get started again. We began last time by introducing the concept of politics, offering the definition, as I said, not just one definition. That's not enough for us. We need to have 3. I think it'll be clear why I offer the 3 definitions here as we go along, okay? So, as we said, the first definition was offered by Harold Laswell way back in the 1940s. It's become the standard definition that we see in all the textbooks and so on. But as I told you last time, it has become sort of cliche. What I mean by that is it's kind of this catchy little thing, and you have no trouble remembering Laswell's definition for the purposes of a quiz. For example, when you come in on Tuesday, if you see a question up there on the screen that says, Harold Laswell defined politics as, you're going to have no trouble going to who gets what, when, and how. That's one of the attractive features of Harold Laswell's definition, is that it is so easy to remember. But because, like a lot of cliches, it really, it leaves us wanting to know, okay, that's fine, it's easy to remember, but what does he mean by that? And so that's why I also introduced Easton's definition. David Easton, a political scientist writing in the 1960s, defined politics as the authoritative allocation of values. And as I said last time, that this is also a definition that's pretty easy to remember, but whereas Laswell's definition is kind of cliche. Easton's definition is jargonistic. We want a definition. We want definition of the terms in his definition, right? What does he mean by authoritative? What does he mean by allocation? What does he mean by values? Now, on that latter concept of values, I try to help out a little bit by modifying the definition just slightly and changing it to valued things. And I don't think that is at all inconsistent with what Easton means. In fact, I think he would approve, because what Easton really wants us to do as we begin to think about politics is to think about it in material terms. Not these sort of, as I said last time, most people today, when they think about values, they think about these nebulous, abstract concepts, kind of slippery, hard to, certainly can't get your hands on them, right? Easton would want us to think in very material or concrete terms about values. But that raises a question, valued by whom, right? And the quick answer to that question, so we can make some progress today, rather than trying to hash it out, is the members of society generally. That doesn't mean that each and every member of society value these things the same. Some people value this thing more than other people, right? But generally in our society, these are things that we value, right? And thinking concretely and materially, I think one of the things that Easton would want us to focus on first and foremost is wealth, right? Is wealth something that is generally valued by our society? You're all nodding your heads, okay? So each individual, anybody know what the population of the United States of America is? Right? Anybody want to take a guess? What? Billion? No, that's probably China. China might be up to 2 billion. I don't know. It's like 340 million or something like that. I think we're gonna have a census this year that'll report to us, right? I think it's like 340 million, maybe 350 million, somewhere in there. When people say give or take a couple million, that's not something to sneeze at, right? Give or take 2 or 3 million, that's the population of Houston, right? Oh, let's just forget about the population of Houston, right? Take that out of it. You understand what I'm saying? At any rate, so not all 340 or 350 million Americans value wealth exactly the same, but you all seem to agree that generally in our society we value wealth. And so Easton is saying that politics is the authoritative allocation of wealth, because wealth is a valued thing. Now, when I think choosing the word wealth here instead of say the word income is important, because if I say income, I think many of you would begin to start to object. Like, wait a minute, our society, income is not allocated by politics, because many of you might be thinking government, right? Well, Easton's not saying, I want to be clear here. He's not saying that income is allocated by politics, although in a sense it is allocated by the political system, right? But wealth, I think, is a better term. Now, in what sense is wealth allocated by the political system in our society? Many of you may believe, like I believed growing up, that the United States of America, we live in a society where a person's share of wealth is determined principally by his or her own talents or abilities, the choices that he or she makes along the way in their life. It's an individually, it's a result of individual decisions and actions. I think many Americans have believed that for a lot of years, and I'm not disputing that. I think I would even concur with that. But what we're trying to say here is that you live in a society that allows individuals to make decisions. You live in a political society that allows individuals to the greatest extent possible to make decisions governing their own lives. Right? Give me an example real quick, of a name that we'll all recognize as being fabulously wealthy? Donald Trump. There's some question about how fabulously wealthy Donald Trump is. What? Jeff Bezos. Okay? Now, government didn't allocate. Do you know how much Bezos is worth? We can Google that real quick. I'm not going to invest the time and energy to do it. Is he worth $100 billion? Okay? Anybody know? Should we invest the time and energy? Let's just do that real quick. We don't want to say something here that's incorrect. If I can get this to come up. Why isn't this coming up?
182 million.
182 billion. Well, I was a little more than halfway there, right? Did you Google that? That's a lot of money. That's the kind of money that my brain can't even really begin to appreciate. Because, anybody, you know the name J.J. Watt? Right? That's a name everybody in here probably knows, right? Anybody know when J.J. Watt signed his very lucrative deal with the Houston Texans 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was, anybody remember how much that was worth? I think it was more than that. It was, I think, a 10-year deal. So I'm talking about the entire 10 years. For some reason, the number 100 million sticks out in my mind. So he was going to make $10 million a year. Does that seem right for a player of J.J. Watt's caliber says? Again, somebody can look it up. I'm not going to invest the time to look it up. But for some reason, that's the number that sticks out in my mind. 100 million. Now, if I had said to you before we started, would you be happy with $1 million? How many of you would say yes? Many of you are saying yes. Some of you may say, well, for my entire life? And I say, okay, how about $1 million a year for the duration of your life? Would you be happy? Many of you, it seems like all of you are saying yes. At that rate, how many years would you have to live to get J.J. Watt kind of money? Well, you'd have to live 100 years, right? That's still way past life expectancy. Maybe by the time you guys get that old, that'll be closer to life expectancy. I don't know. But I think life expectancy is still around 75 or something like that, right? So you might not even live long enough to get that J.J. Watt money at $1 million a year, right? But let's keep the numbers simple. Let's say Jeff Bezos, I was originally right, and it's 100 billion. How many years would you have to get $1 million to get Jeff Bezos money? You'd have to be alive a long, long, long time, right? So that's why I say it's hard for me, and I don't know about you, it's hard for me to really get my head around that kind of money, Jeff Bezos money, right? The amount of money that represents is hard for me to really contemplate unless I think about it in those kinds of terms. But anyway, back on track, even though that's a unthinkably large sum of money, to what extent did the political system allocate that huge personal fortune to Jeff Bezos? Certainly the government didn't do it. But Jeff Bezos is operating in a society which values things like private property and intellectual property rights, right? So that this company that he created, Amazon, which operated on an internet platform, was so novel and so unique when it came into being back in what was the late 1990s or something like that, or early 2000s, that he was able to amass this huge personal fortune as a result, right? You understand what I'm saying? That the political system didn't allocate $182 billion worth of wealth directly to Jeff Bezos. Or how about somebody like Bill Gates? Bill Gates is still pretty wealthy, right? And maybe he's worth about 80 billion or something like that. Maybe let's say 100 billion. How did Bill Gates make his money? okay, Microsoft. And imagine if Bill Gates, all of the things being equal, he had the same talents and abilities, the same intellectual capacity, etc. But instead of living in the United States of America, he lived in a society that doesn't protect private property rights, including copyright. So that, for example, he develops his software in China and he sells a few copies of that perhaps, but I'm talking about in the period which Bill Gates, that the software was developed. Maybe a little bit different today in China, but in those days, I doubt that we would know the name Bill Gates today because he would have developed the software, maybe, as I said, sold a few copies of it, but then because copyright protections are not as stringent in China in those days as they are in the United States, it probably would have just been pirated. Everybody would have copied it, and you understand what I'm saying about how our society, how our political society, because it values the accumulation of personal wealth, makes it possible for individuals to accrue either a lot of personal wealth or very little personal wealth or any point in between. We're going to see in a society that values that a wide disparity in the distribution of wealth. Okay, so Easton's not saying that that the political system directly allocates wealth, or certainly not saying that government directly allocates wealth, but in this particular example, it's more of an indirect allocation. And look, we can plug anything. We're talking about wealth here, but we can plug anything into this that has value and it makes sense. Let me ask you this question before I move on to that point, okay? Is the distribution of wealth ever the subject of political debate and political competition in our society? Are there any political leaders out there? Are there any people out there who are wanting to discuss and talk about the distribution of wealth in our society? Maybe they want to talk about it in terms of fairness. Is it fair? Is it unfair? Is that ever the subject matter of politics in our society? You should all be saying, of course it is, right? Of course it is. That is a huge part of what our politics is about, particularly national politics, okay? So that when you think about it like that, it makes more sense, right? Now, as I started to say, anything of concrete material consequence that we can plug into this definition should make sense, okay? So, for example, if I say education, what Easton is telling us is that politics is the authoritative allocation of education. And again, I'll just ask you the same question that I just asked you about wealth. Is education ever the subject of political discussion, political debate, political contest in our society? Yes, it is. Okay? How about air? Is air a valued thing? Have any of you taken a quick show of hands? Who's taken an economics class? Economists introduce a concept to students in their introductory courses called the free good. Okay? Is air, and so sometimes when when an economist asks a group of students, or in this case, I'm asking you as a political scientist, is air? Give me an example of a free good. Oftentimes, the first thing that students look to is air. Okay. Now, what distinguishes for an economist a free good from an economic good is an economic good has alternative uses. So now let me ask you, does air have alternative uses? Sure, we can use it to breathe and sustain our survival as a species, or we can use it as storage space for toxic pollutants. Obviously, the more toxic pollutants that we put out there in the air, the less breathable air we have. Now, is air, or maybe air quality would be a better way to think about it, is that ever the subject of political debate, discussion, contest? Of course it is. So we can develop as long a list as you want to. Clean water, right? Whatever you want to put on this list, there's certainly lots and lots and lots of things that we can put on this list. We don't have the time to develop a really long list. I think that's probably sufficient for you to begin to appreciate that idea, right? What's the connection then, given what we've said, what's the connection between Laswell's definition and Easton's definition? Are they saying the same thing, or are they saying something different? They're essentially saying the same thing, aren't they? Okay, so what's the connection? The values or the valued things in Easton's definition corresponds to what part of Laswell's definition? Which part of Laswell's definition?
What?
The what? The values or the valued things in Easton's definition are the what of Laswell's definition. Who gets the valued things, how they get them, when they get them. That's politics. That make sense? Okay. I want you to imagine some primitive tribal society living on some remote island in the Pacific Ocean that the rest of the world doesn't know about. We don't know about them, and they don't know about us, right? As of 2021, right? For all they know, we don't exist. For all we know, they don't exist, right? At any rate, they have one thing in the society that they value. Whatever, you use your imagination. And just for the sake of illustration, let's imagine that they keep it in a hole in the ground, a big pit in the ground, right? And every day, the individual members of this tribal community are permitted to line up, queue up, as our British friends say. By the way, they respect the queue, okay? They're permitted to dip into this well and take out as much of this thing as they can possibly carry. They take it back to their individual family dwelling units, and they consume it until they're satiated. And they do this the next day, and the next day after that, and the next day after that, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, etc., until you can predict at some point what's going to happen. They're going to notice that they're running out. And by the way, when that happens, that's when the pushing and shoving starts in line. Right? That's when the bigger, stronger members of society, physically bigger, stronger members of society, perhaps force their way up to the front and take the lion's share for themselves and leave bits for the rest. Now, the society can continue to operate that way, according to the law of the jungle, let's call it. They're operating according to the law of the jungle. The most fit survive, right? Or maybe they've devolved more civilized notions of fairness and equity, and the tribal council hashes out some sort of process for allowing all of the members of society to get enough to survive, right? We'll call that the rule of law. So on the one extreme, you have the law of the jungle, right? On the other extreme, you have the rule of law. Either way, you may have your notions about which you would prefer to live in, but either way, that's politics. It is a process called politics. The society has developed some sort of process for determining who gets this valued thing, when they get it, and how they get it. So yeah, Easton and Laswell are really essentially saying the same thing. Now, I want to come back and talk a little bit about what Easton means by authoritative and what he means by allocation. Well, allocation, let's deal with allocation very quickly, okay? Allocation corresponds to what part of Laswell's definition? Which part of Laswell's definition? To allocate something means to do what? To determine who gets it, right? So they really are saying exactly the same thing, aren't they? All right, well, let me introduce you to my definition of politics. And I want to stop that. I don't, I don't even want to begin to pretend that I deserve to be in the same company as the icons of my discipline, Harold Laswell and David Easton. But I developed this definition of politics to share with my students because I think it says with some specificity what we can only infer from the Laswell and Easton definition. Okay? One thing that this definition says explicitly that we can only infer from the other two definitions is that politics is a competitive process. Right? After all, the things that are valued by society are valued precisely because of this reality. That's my tribal island example should suggest to you, right? It's when things become scarce. If they're not scarce, then they really have no value. It's only when they become scarce that people begin to compete over these things. Now, how they compete, as we said, just depends on the nature of the politics, right? But there's no question that a political process, whatever it looks like, is going to be a competitive process. And if that makes you uncomfortable, if you don't like that, maybe you have some notion that, well, it shouldn't be that way. I mean, after all, shouldn't politics be about what's good for everyone? I'm going to tell you to grow up. Stop being so naive. Politics should be about what's good for everyone. Well, maybe it should be, but that's not the way human societies operate. Maybe when we all die and go to heaven, but in an earthly society, it's the reality. These things are valued precisely because of their scarcity. And when things are scarce, people are in competition with one another. So it's really just a matter of how the society, the process that it develops for determining who gets them, how they get them, and when they get them. So we can have an opportunity this semester to talk a lot more about those kinds of considerations. But right out of the gate, we got to understand that, we've got to be realistic about that. Politics cannot be avoided, or it cannot be expunged from our society. It can't be removed from our society. It's an integral part of how societies operate. If someone can ever tell me what is good for everyone, I mean, beyond some just very broad, extremely broad notions like the country should be prosperous and at peace. Maybe we can get unanimity on that. Those, by the way, those are what political scientists call valence issues. We'll have an opportunity to talk about those later in the semester. Okay? Everybody can agree that the country should be prosperous and at peace. But once we begin to talk about how to promote prosperity or how to keep the peace, that unanimity dissolves away very quickly. And in fact, it may be very difficult even to reach consensus on how to do those things. Would you agree? Big chunk of what our politics is about, isn't it? All right, so my definition begins with this notion that politics is going to be competitive. And that means, by the way, there's going to be winners and losers. Whether we like it or not, the result of politics is that some people are going to win and some people are going to lose. Now, it doesn't have to be in absolute terms. Like, we don't have to think about it in terms of like this person or these people get absolutely everything and this person or these people get absolutely nothing. It doesn't have to be absolute. Instead, it's probably more accurate to think about it in terms of relative winners and relative losers. Some people get relatively more wealth, some people get relatively less wealth. Some people get relatively more education, some people get relatively less education. Some people get relatively more clean air or better quality air, some people get relatively poor quality air, right? So relative winners and losers is the absolute reality of the situation when we talk about politics. Debates over every area of public policy that we have, education policy, environmental policy, tax policy. You know, when politicians debate the question of what taxes we're going to have, we should do away with the personal income tax and have a national sales tax, maybe. Someone says, oh, we should have a flat tax. Don't be fooled. What they're really talking about is the question of who pays. It's really a question about who pays. Okay? So that's another kind of question that we might be able to examine as we go along in the semester. Okay? So competitive process engaged in the society to allocate the scarce resources. And then it throws in one other little thing here that, unfortunately, if I hit hide, what will happen? Will this banner just go away, or will it mess up what I'm doing with the online people? Okay. Online people still with me? Thank you. Okay. So the last little piece here that you don't see in Laswell's definition or Easton's definition, but it's implied, or you can kind of infer it, but only through a lot of hashing stuff out like we've done here in today's class session so far, is said explicitly in my definition, is that it's also the process whereby society determines its priorities. The way that the society allocates its scarce resources is a reflection of its priorities. We can see that in tax policy, for example. The way that we, as a society, tax is a reflection of our priorities. There are some people out there in the political process who want to, change the tax code. Maybe they want to make it more progressive. Like, you understand what I mean by that? Maybe like they want to raise tax rates on the rich. Okay? Now, if they succeed in that because they think the rich should be paying their fair share, as they might put it, whatever that means, okay? And if we do that as a society, we're not ready to talk about government just yet, but if our government does it, if our government changes the tax code in order to soak the rich, as they used to say back in the 100 years ago or whatever, okay? I'm not advocating one or the other. But if we were to do that, would that not be a reflection of our priorities as a society? I think so. How we allocate education, is that not a reflection of our priorities as a society? How we allocate clean air and clean water and any of the other examples that we might use is a reflection of our priorities as a society. If I was to give you an assignment and ask you to go out either on the internet or maybe do the old-fashioned thing, go to a library. Well, in a pandemic, that might be hard, right? In the old days, people used to go to libraries. You know what a library is? People used to go to these buildings called libraries, and they had all these books. And some of the better libraries, like say university libraries, would have government documents collections in them. Okay, so imagine like you're at the University of Texas LBJ School Public Affairs Library or something like that, right? You're at the, one of the libraries at the University of Houston Central Campus or main campus or, whatever, some university, and you I give you an assignment and say, go to the government documents collection and find a budget of the United States, find the budget of the United States for fiscal year 2020. And you manage to get your hands on that copy again, maybe you find it on the internet, right? Assuming that you could read through that document and make sense out of it, I promise you it's a very, very complicated, very large document. And it would be a challenge with no previous experience or guidance to make much sense out of it. But if you could do that, do you think you might come away with some understanding of the priorities of our society, at least as articulated by our national government? Do you think, for example, if you could determine, maybe in a comparative way, if you were to compare the budget of fiscal year 2020 to the budget of, say, fiscal year 2000, 20 years ago, right? Do you think you might be able to say, oh, it looks like our priorities shifted over those 20 years, right? So whereas this was a priority back in 2000, if that's no longer seems to be a priority, and now this thing is a priority. Or maybe among the outlays, if we allocate more budgetary resources to, say, national defense than we do to human services, would that tell us something about our priorities as a society as reflected through our elected decision makers in Washington? I think it would, okay? And budgets are fundamentally political documents. Okay. Let's forge ahead. Our second major concept that we need to begin with here this semester is government. Now, a lot of textbooks define government in this fashion. Maybe it's a little bit different, but this is a pretty common definition of government in a textbook. Government is the legitimate use of force. And while I don't think that's incorrect, I don't think it really gets to the fundamental, gets us a very good fundamental understanding of what government is and why we have government. By the way, that term government, when I say that term government or somebody says that term government, you hear that term government. I think different people have different things that pop into their head. You're taking a class right now called federal government. By the way, there's two aspects of that name of the course that I'm going to object to. Let me digress here for just a second. I promise you I'll get back on track here as quickly as possible. I'm going to suggest to you that, well, nobody consulted with me before they named this course. If they had, I would have said, well, don't name it federal government. That's not a good name for this course. On the first term, federal, I would suggest that it's really not appropriate because the term federal, when you hear the term federal government, I think many people think of the government in Washington, right? Or they might sort of get even visual images, the Capitol building in Washington or the White House or the Supreme Court building, right? They might think of those institutions in Washington, right? And what I'm suggesting to you is that that term federal really also means state and local governments as well. You're going to take another course, if you haven't already taken Government 2306, Texas government, where you learn about state and local government. You all know that we have a government in Washington. That's what a lot of people think when they say the government, right? Whatever reason that they're thinking about the government in Washington. So we have that government, okay? And then we have 50 state governments. And then we have literally tens of thousands of local governments in this country, municipal governments, county governments, special purpose governments like school districts and river authorities and hospital districts and noxious weed control districts and levee improvement districts and on and on. In Texas, we have no shortage of local governments. Okay? We have a lot of them. So, which government are you talking about when you say the government? Well, as I said, I think most people are thinking about, like, the first thing that pops in their head is the government in Washington. My point to you is that that word federal really means all. It really means all of that. We're going to learn about federalism around, I think around week 5 or week 6 or something like that in this class. And that point will become clear to you, right, what federal means. But I wouldn't have named this course federal government. I might have suggested the use of the word national instead of federal. But I even still object to the word government as a title for the course because, as I hinted at a moment ago, when people hear the word government, they tend to think about these institutional arrangements. They think about Congress or the president or the courts or maybe even bureaucracies or something like that, or at the state level, the governor, the state legislature, state agencies, and so on, or at the local level, the mayor of the city council, and so that we tend to think about government in an institutional way. Now, in this course, Government 2305, do we have topics on the Congress, the president, the courts, and the bureaucracies? You bet, we do. But if you look at that syllabus, particularly the topical syllabus at the end, the topical outline, there weren't just those 4 topics on the syllabus, right? In fact, we don't even get to those topics until well past the halfway point of the semester. What do we do in the rest of the semester? Oh, well, lots of other topics on that syllabus. We begin here with this introductory topic, but then we move on to the American economic system, and we move on to ideology and political culture, and we move on to a topic on political parties and interest groups and there's lots of stuff that we deal with in this course that's not specifically dealing with government institutions. So I wouldn't call it federal government. I wouldn't even call it national government. I would suggest the national political system. That's what I would say. The national political system would be a better term for the course. But as I said, nobody consults me. And if they had, they probably would have been sorry. So we're never going to consult him again. Right? The guy's a wacko. Do you understand what my point is, though? That the concept of political system is bigger. It's broader. It's more inclusive than the term government. Is government and politics something that we think about oftentimes that go hand in hand? Of course, right? Of course it is. But I bet you also have some appreciation for the fact that there's politics in other kinds of institutions. There's politics in churches. There's politics in colleges and universities. There's politics in business. There's politics in your local neighborhood association, homeowners association. That's not government, right? There's politics in Little League Baseball. Have any of you ever been involved in Little League Baseball? Trust me, I can tell you from experience, when my son was coming up and playing Little League Baseball, I was pretty heavily involved, and there's a lot of politics in Little League Baseball. And a lot of conflict over, who gets the best players, who gets the best practice facilities, who gets, and a lot of it is very political. So politics is a bigger concept. It's a more inclusive concept. And so in this course, we're dealing with topics on American national government, the institutions of government, but we're also dealing with some other stuff as well, external to government, related to, but external to government. Okay, at any rate, back on track here. Close up that digression and get back on track. A lot of textbooks define government as the legitimate use of force, and as I said, while that's not incorrect, I don't think that it's satisfactory. Okay? What do they mean by legitimate? What do we mean by legitimate? Legitimate in this sense means that most members of society see government and its use of force as appropriate. If I was to ask you, why do you obey the speed limit when you get out there on Interstate 69? Because you don't want to get a ticket. Why don't you want to get a ticket? It doesn't feel good to get a ticket, right? There's a financial penalty there, right? At least, okay? What you mean then is that you obey the speed limit because government forces you to do that? May not be able to force each and every person, but just the threat of police officers being out there with their radar set up is enough to make people at least be cautious, right, about the speed limit. Right? What if I was to ask you, why do you think the police can give you a ticket? How about this scenario? You're driving down after this class is over, you hop in your car, you're rushing to go have some lunch, and you look in your rearview mirror and you see the flashing lights, and true to your driver's training, you pull over to the far right, and you're looking in your rearview mirror and you see you see a guy in a uniform striding up, right? Comes to your window and says license and registration. You give it to him, goes back to his cruiser, comes back, hands you a ticket, and says sign this. Why do you do all that? What have you noticed on his uniform? He had a badge, and it said on the badge, Temple. What if it? I was there for way too long. What if it said? What is the name of the mall down here? First Colony. What if it said First Colony Mall Security? And he gives you this ticket. What do? You rip it to shreds and throw it at him and peel out and go 90? What if it said, the Archdiocese of Houston Galveston on his badge? Catholic Church Security. No? You still don't? No, but you don't know that until you see his badge. Right? What if it says Fagan's Goons? You don't recognize any of those as being legitimate, do you? If it says City of Sugar Land Police Department or State of Texas Department of Public Safety or something like that, somehow you recognize that as legitimate. And so you sign that ticket and you keep your court date, right? What's the difference? Well, First Colony Mall, private businesses, the Catholic Church, a religious institution, and William Fagan, a private citizen, you don't recognize as having legitimate authority over your behavior when you get behind the wheel of a car. I'm going to tell you that it's not really the force, because I'm telling you, my goons, they can turn up the heat on you. It's not really the force, I don't think, that causes you to conclude that it's legitimate. Where does that legitimacy come from? For our purposes, legitimacy means the willingness of members of society to accept the authority of government, its decisions and actions as appropriate, and thereby binding on their behavior. For our purposes, legitimacy means the willingness of members of a society to accept the authority of government, its decisions and actions as appropriate, and thereby binding on their behavior. But again, I ask you, why do we have that understanding? Why do we attach that to government and not these other institutions? It's not because of the force that government can wield, at least not in our society and democratic societies in general. I think it's because we know somewhere along the way we were taught and we came to accept almost without question that whatever authority government has comes from us in the first place. I heard somebody just mention the words the Constitution, which begins with those three words, we the people. Right? We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, for all these purposes that we have, blah, 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 blah. We do establish and ordain this government and give it this authority to make these governing decisions. That's where the legitimacy comes from. It comes from us, we believe. In a democratic society, that is an almost universally held belief. Notice I said a democratic society. We haven't gotten far enough along yet to make the we're not too far away from making the distinction between like democratic societies and authoritarian societies. It's probably would want to think about it a little bit differently in an authoritarian society, but in a democratic society, ultimately we believe that that authority comes from us. So that brings us to a quick discussion here of a couple of very important concepts for us as we proceed this semester. The concept of popular sovereignty is the idea that ultimate political authority resides with the people. Ultimately, political power rests with the people. That is a fairly new notion in human history. It really traces back, certainly most directly, to a period of Western history known as the Age of Enlightenment, which is primarily the 18th century, the 1700s. And I think it's worth noting that our society, our political system, the United States of America, however you want to think about this, was founded during this period. As everyone in here knows, the United States declared their independence from Great Britain in 1776, and the Constitution was written in 1787 and took effect in 1789. Those very important formative events occurred during a period called the Age of Enlightenment. And one of the very enlightened notions of that era was the concept of popular sovereignty. See, before the Age of Enlightenment, it was widely viewed by Westerners certainly that the king was sovereign. The ultimate source of power was the king or the monarchy. I think in some countries where they still have a king or a queen, where they still have monarchs, they might even still use that kind of language. They might even refer to the queen in Britain as the sovereign. But that's only in style. Great Britain is what we call a constitutional monarchy, and its system of government is really based, as ours is, on the principle of popular sovereignty. Maybe there are other countries that have, old style, old-fashioned monarchies where the king really is sovereign, like say Saudi Arabia, where the king really is the ultimate source of political authority. But there aren't too many of those left in the world. When the Americans in 1787 wrote that phrase into the Constitution, in the preamble, "We the people of the United States of America," establishment, they are fully and full-throated endorsing the concept of popular sovereignty. Government gets its authority from the people and nowhere else. And by the way, what had kings believed about their authority before this period called the Age of Enlightenment? Anybody ever heard of divine right theory? What does that mean? King gets his authority from God. By the way, if you think about the implications of that for a moment, if the king governs by divine right, if the king gets his authority from God, isn't that a perfect justification of absolute rule? If I'm king and I get my authority from God, who are you to challenge me? If you challenge me, you challenge God. Enlightenment thinkers no longer accepted that notion. All right, the second concept here that's going to be important for us as we move ahead is consent of the governed. We're going to describe this as the decisions and actions of government are considered legitimate only when government derives its authority from the governed. Most practically through an institutional arrangement of elections whereby the governed select their representatives. There's a little typo in there. Please forgive me for that. Sometimes they get past me. Only when government, not governments, only when government derives its authority from the governed. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these ends, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." In a very concise little statement there, Jefferson tells us where government gets its authority from. If we could get Mr. Jefferson in here, dig him up and dust him off and bring him in here and ask him, "Mr. Jefferson, where does government get its authority from?" I think he would be so sad. I think his shoulders would slump and his head would dip, and he would say, "You haven't read my Declaration, have you?" By the way, did you know that Thomas Jefferson wrote his own epitaph on his tombstone in Monticello? Have any of you ever been to Monticello and made that pilgrimage to Monticello? You should. Okay? Anybody know where that is? What state that's in? It's in Virginia. So next time you're in Virginia, make a side trip to Monticello. It's worth it. Okay? So you find Jefferson's, burial site, and there is his tombstone there with the inscription that he authorized. He identified three things that he thought were his noteworthy contributions to the United States of America and humanity. One was the author of the Statutes of Religious Freedom of Virginia. The other was founder of the University of Virginia. And the other was the Declaration of Independence. Nothing there about his presidency, Louisiana Purchase, or any of the things, nothing about his scientific contributions or any of the other things that are very noteworthy about Jefferson. All right? I think he would be so sad that we weren't intimately familiar with his declaration. Because he tells us in the Declaration of Independence pretty concisely why we have government. Deriving its just authority, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. And he tells us very concisely where government gets its authority from. Deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed. Okay? And as it says here, the most practical way that that's done in a democratic society is through an institutional arrangement called an election, where people like you and me get to select the people who are going to be our voices in the assembly. Whether that's the Congress of the United States or the state legislature in Austin or the city council or whatever the assembly is. Okay, questions about any of that? All right, so let's wrap up on this point here. We've got about 2 minutes. So I'm going to discourage you from those textbook definitions. By the way, if you remember, I told you on Tuesday that you're going to notice that there are some times when the way I define a term is different than the way that the authors of the textbook define a term or discuss and describe a term. Here's a case in point, right out of the gate here in week 1. This is not the same definition of government that the authors of your textbook give you. So when you come in and take that quiz on Tuesday, the lecture quiz, and it says government can best be defined as, you're going to skip over the definition that you saw in the textbook, and you're going to find this definition. Government refers to the structured arrangements in a society that produces and enforces decisions resolving conflicts over scarce resources. A couple of things here real quick before I run out of time. You can see how government now is connected to politics, right? Because I included those words scarce resources in there. Government, the decisions it makes and the actions that it undertakes, policy actions that it undertakes, is the mechanism for allocating scarce resources. Sometimes it's direct, but often it's indirect. Okay? So there's a connection there between this definition of government and the previous discussion that we had about politics, right? Your intuition is right. There is a close connection between politics and government. Okay? Give me 1 second to make this last point, okay? All right? So the second thing I want to point out to you is the word structure, the structure arrangement. So what I mean by that is that government's not just random. It's not just this random phenomenon. It is, in developed societies, most often institutionalized. We think about the institutions of government. There's some structure there, right? The Congress of the United States, the President of the United States, the courts, etc., the state government. There's institutional arrangements, and those are structured. The government doesn't have to be structured. It can be quite informal, right? Think of some society that maybe is governed by warlords, okay? Where governing decisions are made by this local warlord who has people who are personally loyal to him, and they have lots of guns and ways to force people to do things, right? Okay, we're out of time. We'll see you on Tuesday.